Hello Nancy Drew fans, welcome back to another book to game comparison video. Today I'm going to be looking at the Nancy Drew game Alibi in Ashes and the two books that it was inspired by. So the first was released in 1990, it is False Impressions and it is part of the Case File series. And the second book that the game is based off of is The Clues Challenge, released in 2001 and is part of the Digest paperback series. And these two books together make up the 2011 game Alibi in Ashes. This is a comparison video that I'm really looking forward to doing because this game pulls details from both books, and we haven't actually seen a lot of that in the more recent games to this point. There have been very few details plucked from a book and put into a game, but this is a totally different story. This game has a whole bunch of elements from the two books that it is based on. So I've been really eager to jump into this one. And you know what, let's do that. Let's jump on in. So we'll start by going over the two books, and we're going to start with the Case File. This is book number 43 of that series, and it is False Impressions. So in this book, Nancy has been suspected of extorting citizens in Mapleton. This is a nearby community. So she, along with her friends and family, are determined to find out who's been impersonating her, who's using her name, who's been taking money from people, and also ruining her reputation as a reliable detective. In addition to this, Carson is sort of extra worried about Nancy's well-being, not just because of what's happening in Mapleton, but because of a recent case he helped with. There was a criminal whose brothers he helped put away, and he has threatened Carson and Carson's family. So he's a bit worried that his daughter might be in danger because of this individual. But as our story continues along, that criminal winds up dead. So he is no longer a threat, but then there's the question of, were the Drews involved in his demise? And there are a whole bunch of other hurdles for Nancy. So she's got this reputation of being a detective. It's been a little bit ruined, and Brenda Carlton, well-known reporter, has made that even more difficult for Nancy because she decides to report on the story of extortion. She's very careful with the language she uses. She says alleged rather than saying that Nancy's actually guilty, but that leaves quite a negative impression. And though Nancy would like to clear her name and speak with the victims of extortion, they don't trust her. So Nancy takes advantage of Brenda having gone away for a short period and decides to disguise herself as the reporter. And in this guise, she's able to interview the fraudster's victims. So we've got quite a few characters in this book. We'll start with Lieutenant Pete Kowalski. So he is the lieutenant from Mapleton, and he's the one who initially comes to River Heights to arrest Nancy. And he's the one who's continuing to work on the case, even when she's let out of jail. And then we have Elizabeth or Beth Hackney and Donald Eklund. They are both victims of extortion. Then we have Barry Aitken, whose real name is Neil Macklin, and as Barry, he is Beth's boyfriend, and he's sort of working on a scheme with Andrea Tenenbaum, who is supposedly Barry's niece, but really her real name is Leila Macklin. She is his wife, and they are trying to swindle Beth Hackney for even more money. And Leila is the one who goes and uses Nancy's name and wig to impersonate the sleuth. And then finally we have Joe Crane. This is the criminal whose brothers Carson helps put away and who winds up dead. So there's a lot of investigating going on, Nancy having to disguise herself and dealing with a few different criminals. And what we discover was that Joe Crane wasn't actually all that involved. He did run into the two Macklins and insisted that they help him with getting revenge against Carson. But that doesn't come to pass. Neil decides to kill him. Bye-bye, Joe Crane. There's one obstacle out of the way for both the Macklins and for Nancy. And then the Macklins together continue with their con in Mapleton, and again hoping to swindle Elizabeth Hackney out of even more money. But Nancy and her friends figure it all out as they look into Barry and Andrea and realize they are not who they claim to be. So there is a general overview of the book False Impressions. A lot going on there, a lot of really serious stuff going on. And let's look at the second book. So this is from the Mystery Stories series, or Digest paperback series as they're also called. It's book number 163, and it is called The Clues Challenge. So in this book, we have Nancy and George who have joined Ned's fraternity for a clues challenge. So I shouldn't say they're not members of the fraternity, but their group of students, outsiders, are allowed to come in and join their team for this outdoor scavenger hunt. And they have decided to help out because a bunch of the other students happen to be away on the weekend of this event. So a nice opportunity for Nancy and George to get out and have some fun. Well, you'd hope they'd have fun, but the problem is their team is repeatedly sabotaged. Their food is tainted. Some stairs that they have to run up get soaked down and someone slips and injures themselves. George's skis wind up being sabotaged. They're broken. A tree branch gets sawn. There's a whole lot of dangerous sabotage that befalls this team of students. And in addition to this, Nancy is trying to figure out why their team's being sabotaged. She discovers another crime, and that the sponsor of this event, whose name is Mel Lorenzo, he is being blackmailed. He won't admit to it, but Nancy's figured out that, he's being blackmailed, but she doesn't know why. And she does wonder, does it relate to the clues challenge? But then learns the blackmail started before he took on the opportunity to sponsor this event. So why is this man being blackmailed and by whom? And he also doesn't seem to be willing to accept that their team is being sabotaged. It's not quite that he's turning a blind eye, but he feels that he needs more proof. But he does seem very resistant to believing the team. So with this book, there are also quite a few characters. Most of them are participants in the Clues Challenge. We have Grant Dempsey and CJ Thompson. They are both on the team with Ned, Nancy, and George. Then we have Dee Dee Malone, who is CJ's girlfriend, and she's on another team. We have Joyce Swenson, who is also on yet another team, and Dennis Garcia. And you bet he's on yet another team. So we've got about 4 teams competing. And with regard to Dennis, he and CJ don't get along very well. And part of this is because CJ is bound for the Olympics and he's got some fame. He's really well respected. And his girlfriend Dee Dee used to date Dennis. So Dennis feels quite hurt by CJ and is quite jealous, but he won't admit the jealousy. Then we have Randy Cohen, who is a reporter, and he's doing a story on CJ, which doesn't help the relationship with Dennis. And then we have Mel Lorenzo, so he is the sports store owner for Sportsmania and the sponsor behind the Clues Challenge. But we also learn that that's not his real name. His real name is Andrew Papazian, better known as Pops. So as Nancy's looking into the sabotage and what she suspects is blackmail, she discovers that Dennis, as well as Randy later on, have discovered a secret about Mel, and that is that his real name is Andrew Papazian, and he's the man behind a point-fixing scheme 3 years ago. But he got away, and these 3 students who were involved in doing the point-fixing went down without him. Dennis is particularly upset about this because it involves someone he knew, and he trusted Pops. So he decides to blackmail him. And he also has Mel, or Andrew, sabotage the Omegas, that's Ned's team, to help ensure that Dennis's team, wins the challenge. So again, like the other story, there's actually quite a lot going on here. We've got some sabotage, we've got blackmail, plus following all these clues for this challenge, which is a lot of fun, but also dangerous. So quite a few elements to the story, but it's a really fun and engaging story. So with that, let's look at the game that these 2 stories have created. This is the 25th Nancy Drew game, Alibi in Ashes. So while pursuing a clue for the Clues Challenge, or what Nancy thinks is a clue, she winds up in a burning building and then is arrested for arson. Then we have Ned, Bess, and George who are helping to track down evidence and interview suspects to help free Nancy from jail. And they wind up being successful, not necessarily in terms of proving her innocence, but that there's enough evidence to challenge her guilt. So then Nancy is freed and she can help with the investigation. And they basically learned pretty early on that Nancy's been set up. She's been framed for the crime of burning the building, and someone want her to take the fall for that. The question is who is, and most of the suspects have a grudge against Nancy for one reason or another. And those characters are Chief McGinnis, so he is the one who arrested Nancy, but he's a pretty good chief. He's willing to let her prove her innocence. She just can't get caught. Then we have Antonia, or Tony Scolari, as we know her best, who is the owner of Scoops, and she thinks Nancy and her friends are a bit of a nuisance and make the local police and politicians look bad. We have Deirdre Shannon, same age as Nancy and her friends, who's also participating in the Clues Challenge. She doesn't like Nancy Besser George, but is rather fond of Ned. Then we have Alexei Markovic, who has a rather sad history with the community. He was accused of a crime, and he's never been able to prove his innocence. And he owns a local antique shop and really roots for Nancy. And finally, we have Brenda Carlton, who is a reporter who is really jealous of Nancy. Nancy, unfortunately, has scooped some of her stories when she's solved crimes, and Brenda's really irritated with this, to say the least. So as Nancy and her friends are investigating, trying to figure out who burned down the building and why, and did they intentionally frame Nancy, what comes out is that it was an act of revenge. Brenda is so fed up with Nancy interfering with her investigative stories that, in particular the Antiquities case, that Brenda frames her for the arson and then tries to ruin her career as a town sleuth. So it's ultimately Brenda behind this, but also fair to say that Tony was a respectable suspect because she considers, again, Nancy and her friends to be troublesome, and she won't entertain the idea that Nancy's innocent, so she doesn't help Nancy's cause. And that is Alibi in Ashes. So now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty and do some actual comparisons. And this is where I'm really excited. So we'll start by looking at the titles. All three titles are different. We have False Impressions, The Clues Challenge, and Alibi in Ashes. Clearly the game title did not come from one of the books. And part of this is because the crime is different. There's no fire or arson in either of the books. And that is a big part of the game, so that is presumably where Her Interactive chose to take the title from. False Impressions is an okay title. I mean, for the book, it's so-so, and the idea is that there's now this false impression about who Nancy is. We kind of focus on that in the game, but not enough for that to have been a suitable title, in my opinion. The Clues Challenge, being the title of the second book, I think would have been a good title. However, we're focused more on Nancy and the crime than we are in the actual challenge. That would not have been quite as suitable a title. So I think it is fair that Her Interactive changed the title. Had they focused the game a little bit more on the Clues Challenge and actually actively looking for clues and solving clues, then maybe the Clues Challenge would have been the right title to go with. Next, let's look at storylines, and we're going to see fairly quickly how the game has taken elements from both of the books. So the first book we're going to look at is False Impressions. So I know we've just gone over this, but let's quickly do it again. Nancy's accused of extortion, and she has to find the person who's behind all this, who's masquerading as her. In the second book, The Clues Challenge, Nancy and her friends participate in a scavenger hunt that is riddled with sabotage. And both of those are part of the storyline for the game. So Nancy is following up on a clue for the scavenger hunt. So there we go, taken from book number 2. And then she's framed and arrested for arson. So here we have her framed of a crime. It's not extortion, it's arson. So the crime itself is different between the first book and the game, but we still have a crime that she's framed for. And Nancy is investigating who's really behind the crime. So that's really easy, plain as day. This game took its storyline from both of these books that it's based off of, which is fantastic. I love seeing that. And even our locations are pretty much the same. False Impressions is set primarily in Mapleton, but also a bit in River Heights. The Clues Challenge, we don't actually know the community where Emerson College is located. That's where the story takes place, is mostly on the campus, a little bit in the community, which lacks a name. We just know it's not in River Heights, but not that far away. So same general area. And then the game, of course, is set in River Heights. So there we go. Our locations are basically the same. And now let's look at a really long list of all these characters who are one character in the game. And this is brilliant, if I may say so. So I'm going to start by looking at some characters from False Impressions, then some characters from the Clues Challenge, and then the one character that all of these folks are in the game. So for False Impressions, we have Layla. So she is the criminal who assumes Nancy's identity, and this is in order to extort people of their money. She also happens to use another alias, and that's Andrea Tannenbaum. So her main thing, she's taken Nancy's identity. She's the perpetrator of a crime. Another character from this book is Joe Crane. He seeks revenge against Carson Drew and threatens to harm his family. Main thing about him, revenge. Then we have Brenda Carlton, reporter in the Case Files series. We see her in multiple books. And she publishes a rather unflattering story about Nancy and the extortion case. So, Brenda making Nancy look bad in the press. That's the main thing about those characters for False Impressions. Jump over to the Clues Challenge. We have the character of Joy, who's previously won this challenge, but she's so determined to win again. And she has a bit of a problem with Nancy. And she decides she's kind of not intentionally, but sort of going to frame Nancy. And this is in terms of her needing to meet a classmate late at night. And the Clues Challenge rules are that you can't look for clues between certain hours. She's worried that if she's seen meeting this friend in the forest at night, it's going to look like she's cheating. So she takes Nancy's toque so that if she is spotted, Nancy's going to be blamed for breaking the rules. Not that Joy's actually breaking the rules, but it's a fallback and she's willing to, harm Nancy and the Omega team. So her main thing, dressing up, framing Nancy. And then we also have Randy, who is a reporter who is initially writing a story on CJ, but then he discovers this other story about Mel and works on that. The main thing about him, for the purposes of this, is that he is a reporter. So now look at the game. We have Brenda. All of these 4 characters relate to Brenda Carlton from the game. She reports on the arson and strongly suggests that Nancy is guilty. Basically like she does in False Impressions. She's responsible for the fire and for framing the sleuth. Well, that's a bit like Layla. Layla, although there was no fire, she frames Nancy by impersonating her. Brenda in the game also dresses up as Nancy, as does Layla, and so does Joy by taking the team hat when she goes out to meet a classmate at night. And then throwing in Joe from False Impressions, his desire for revenge, that's same with Brenda from the game. She wants revenge against Nancy. And then Randy, simply the aspect of being a reporter. So we see how Her Interactive managed to take elements from 4 characters, and that's including Brenda herself from the book, to put into Brenda Carlton from the game. And I love it. I think it's so great that we see all this overlap with one character, because they couldn't put all of these characters from 2 different books into the game. So this to me is just perfect. Moving on, this one is a bit more of a stretch. So we've got Mel and Alexi. Mel, also known as Andrew. So they've both been involved in the law in the past. So with the book The Clues Challenge, we have Mel, which is not his real name. Mel Lorenzo is actually Andrew Papazian, and he led a point-fixing scheme and skipped town during the trial. He is then blackmailed and sabotages the Omega Chi Epsilon team. He also owns his own business. Now his counterpart for the game is Alexi, and he was a kid detective who was framed for theft. So here we see the crime part. So point fixing for Andrew and framed for theft for Alexi. Alexi also has this distrust for politicians, and he was innocent of the crime for which he was accused. That's where we do have a difference. Andrew, or Mel, whichever name you'd prefer, he was guilty. Alexi was not. And also Alexi is also a business owner. So we've got a little bit of overlap. I know I'm stretching it. I said that at the beginning, but if I can, I'm going to make characters work as being the same person. And I'm going to do it one more time. So we have Dee Dee and Deirdre. So we're looking at the Clues Challenge book again, and there is a member from one of the other teams, and her name is Dee Dee. She's CJ's girlfriend, and she's simply another participant. Her role is really minimal. She doesn't really impact the story much. Although if we'll look at Dennis in a little bit, he used to date Dee Dee, and so Dee Dee is sort of a catalyst for some of the jealousy that Dennis feels for CJ. But really beyond that, her role is not that important in the book. In the game, we have Deirdre, who is sometimes called Dee Dee. Bess and George like to call her that. And she cheats during the Clues Challenge, and she suspects Team Danger of also cheating. So that's not the case for Dee Dee from the game, or sorry, from the book. She doesn't cheat. And then Deirdre also follows who she thinks is Nancy so that she can try and get ahead with the clues challenge. So a little bit of overlap, similar names, both being on different teams than Nancy. An interesting thing too about Deirdre Shannon is that she is a character from a different Nancy Drew series that this game is not based off of. She's a regular character in the Nancy Drew Girl Detective books. So it's kind of funny that one of those books was not listed as being part of the inspiration for this game, but that really would have been a stretch. So that's it for overlapping characters. The next few are either book only or game only. So we'll start with CJ. So he has a future in the Olympics. He's broken records. He's really well respected. And there's a story being written about him over the course of the Clues Challenge. And he falls victim to one of the acts of sabotage. And that's really it. CJ's a good guy. There's not a whole lot else. Really, the purpose of him in the book is to help drive Dennis's jealousy, as well as for why Randy happens to be at the college. So let's then move to Dennis, who's also only in the book. He's jealous of CJ, and he recognized Andrew Papazian. No, so he knew that Mel was not his real name. And he winds up blackmailing him. And he does this partly out of revenge because of the pain he caused his friends and family during the point fixing scheme. He also wants the answers to the Clues Challenge. And he has Andrew sabotage the Omega team for him. So no true game counterpart. I mean, all the awful things. I mean, he's behind part of the trouble, so you could say, he's like Brenda, but he's his own character. Following this, let's look at one more character. This is Tony, who is only in the game. She's a businesswoman who dislikes Nancy, and she is unwilling to help the teen prove her innocence. She also has some plans for the old town hall, which make her really suspicious and not very nice in general. She's kind of sneaky. And, in some ways I thought, can I make her and Dennis kind of similar? But they're not. They're unique characters. So there's Tony. So the next few points are just some mostly overlapping elements, things I wanted to point out. There's one that is not about overlap. So the first thing is obviously Nancy being arrested. So in both False Impressions and in the game Alibi and Ashes, Nancy is arrested for a crime she did not commit. So there's that element of the game from a book. Also from the same book, we have community celebrations. So in False Impressions, Mapleton has celebrated their Founders' Day the night before Nancy's arrest. Alibi and Ashes, we have the Anvil Day celebrations, and that's what closes out the Clues Challenge. So there's again a little bit of overlap. And then of course we have the element of disguises. This comes up a whole bunch in False Impressions and the game. So Nancy and Brenda disguise themselves as one another. So in False Impressions, Nancy disguises herself as Brenda. In the game, Brenda has disguised herself as Nancy. And in addition to that, Layla Macklin, of course, disguised herself as Nancy when she was impersonating her. So a whole bunch of that. Then we have the element of Carson being out of town, also from False Impressions. Carson is initially snowed in Chicago, so he can't help Nancy when she is initially taken into custody. Whereas in the game, he's much further away. He's in Australia. And then the one other thing I wanted to point out is where there's actually a difference, and that has to do with the season. Both of the books are set in winter. So it's lovely, snowy wintertime. The game is in summer, so totally different. And I'm admittedly really bummed that Her Interactive didn't set this game in the winter. Give me snow. I love the winter games. So that's pretty much it. Let's now conclude. Her Interactive's 2011 release, Alibi and Ashes, is really quite a good adaptation of two Nancy Drew stories. So again, those are the case file False Impressions and digest paperback The Clues Challenge. The game pulls details from both books very well, but there is a clear focus on False Impressions for the majority of their material. Really all we're taking from The Clues Challenge is the fact that there is an event called The Clues Challenge. What happens in the book as far as the challenge is not emulated in the game by any means. There are some overlapping elements also from both books and the game, so our similarity as far as location, River Heights, Mapleton area, all the disguises, the role of reporters, and even like a small detail, there's a place called Happy Pancake in False Impressions. In the game, we have Pancake City. So there we go. Another little one, to me, this stood out right away, even though it's not quite the same. In the previous clues challenge in the book, they found a clue, if not the final banner, down a well. So we have this space that's going underground. And in the game, we have the underground tunnels. So it's sort of a similarity there. It's not the exact same, but there is a similarity there as far as where we find the medallion at the end of the game with where the previous year they'd had their banner. And we've got a few changes as far as characters. So lots were removed. I mean, we don't see Beth Hackney. We don't see Donald Eklund from False Impressions. We don't see the majority of the other Clues Challenge contestants in the game. They're unnecessary. You can only have so many characters in the game, and we see a bunch of characters from the books merged into one for the game. And then we have new characters created, like Tony and somewhat Alexi. Like I said, he kind of pulls from Mel or Andrew, but he is sort of unique as well in terms of his history of having been a kid detective in his own right. And ultimately, I'm pleasantly surprised by how well Her Interactive melded these two books together to create this Nancy Drew game. They did a good job. And that is my comparison. The one thing that does really bother me, and I failed to mention it during my playthrough, though I had intended to discuss it, is the choice of culprit. So in the game, we have Brenda Carlton, who is our culprit. But she's not the culprit in the book, and why this bothers me is because Brenda is a recurring character in the Case Files series. So it's always really bugged me that we have someone who, a nuisance though she may be, pops up quite a bit in the series and is not meant to be a criminal. Pain in the butt, certainly, but not a perpetrator of a crime. So that is my one big problem with Alibi and Ashes, was that choice, that change. I would far rather have seen Tony be the culprit, although that would have been really obvious. I still think that would have been better. Or create another character, have another suspect who is more like Layla, or like Dennis or Andrew, someone along those lines rather. And the other downside to them having put Brenda in that role is that she can't come back now as a recurring character without being a criminal. And I think this is a big loss of opportunity. I sort of think that she would have been a good character to come back, and especially in terms of helping Nancy solve a case. And I don't really want to spoil another game. In case anyone hasn't played The Deadly Device, I'm just going to say that we do have a character who comes back in that. And I think, though that character is fantastic, I love their role, I think that would have been a good opportunity for Brenda to have come back had she not been a culprit, because they help with getting information and having contacts with reporters. And that opportunity was taken away by making her the culprit. So that is the one change that disappoints me the most. The other thing I wish hadn't been changed was the time of year. I wish this had been a winter game. But Her Interactive did do a good job. And I mean, it fits very well. It works very well being a summer setting. And again, I am impressed with what they were able to do with their source material. Taking these two books, again, primarily focusing on False Impressions, but taking elements from both and turning them into a game. And they did it in a really good way. It's not my favorite game, and I said that during the playthrough. But it is nice. It's fun. It's a good way to spend a couple of hours. And having been able to tell this story from two books that already had stories, was really good. They just did a good job. And that's really the way I'm going to keep putting it. It is good. So that is going to wrap it up. Thank you everyone for watching this book to game comparison of Alibi and Ashes, which was based on False Impressions, and the Clues Challenge. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in the next one. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.